congregation has received nomination forms for the president and vice presidents of the synod. Please encourage your pastor and congregational leaders to fill out and return these nomination forms before February 20th of 2019. Learn more at issuesetc.org/nominations. issuesetc.org/nominations.
We love our on-demand listeners. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Do you need a home mortgage, car, or student loan in 2019? Check out Lutheran Federal Credit Union. During January, when you open a Lutheran FCU loan to meet your financial needs, or when you use your Lutheran FCU credit card for a qualifying amount of purchases, Lutheran FCU will give you cash back and give that same amount of money to their Ministry of the Month, Christ Community International. Learn more at LutheranFCU.org. Lutheran FCU, good for you, good for the church. LutheranFCU.org.
There are nearly 20 million college students in the United States. 40% will stop going to church during college. 50% will never return. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is seeking to meet this challenge through LCMSU. Why? Because 100% of college students matter to God and to His church. College is tough. You need Jesus. We'll help. LCMSU. Check us out at lcms.org/LCMSU.
Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. We're getting a Washington update. Mark Hemingway, a Washington, D.C. journalist for 20 years, is our guest. Mark, there was a 2017 study called The True Size of Government by Paul Light, professor of public service at New York University, and that reported that the federal government's blended workforce is 7 to 9 million people, including contractors and grantees. How did we get to this point?
Well, this is sort of the central question of the last 130 years or so. Starting in the late 19th century, there was sort of we had the Progressive Revolution, the original Progressive Revolution that was, based on a lot of sort of Hegelian thought about how government administration should be, affected by this idea that man was transcending its nature and that you could trust to have armies of bureaucrats that were acting in completely unself-interested ways to solve all of our problems. And you saw a lot of things like, as a result of that fundamentally changed American governance, like passing amendments that, allowed for the direct election of senators and all sorts of other, things came out of the Progressive Revolution that sort of completely upended our traditional notions of American restrained constitutionalism. So, yeah, it's just been this sort of steady march of, this ever-expanding administrative state in this country, and it has pretty dramatic effects on our lives anymore, both for good and for ill, and government shutdowns, force us to consider this. One thing that certainly happened is, I think the census report just reported that the 5 richest counties in the United States, per capita between 2013 and 2017, all immediately surround Washington, D.C., and that's because the federal workforce earns a lot of money at the expense of taxpayers. And the average federal worker, even after controlling for education and other differences, earns significantly more in pay and benefits than the average private sector employee. And they're nearly unfireable. And they have unbelievable amounts of power anymore because they're allowed to determine how regulations are implemented, which makes them de facto unelected legislators. It's really, truly a giant, thorny political science problem. And when Trump talks about the deep state or draining the swamp, that really, really resonates with Americans. Problem is we don't have a very good actual political program for doing anything about it. For one thing, we definitely need civil service reform. We need to be able to fire public employees. And when we had the crisis in the VA and the Obama administration, almost no one suffered any consequences in the VA, and their negligence was literally causing American veterans to die. It's politically impossible for even the President of the United States to directly fire a federal government employee anymore, and that has to be fixed. We've got to rein in the size of government for sure. It's not to say that we don't have essential services. The thing that gets lost in the debate is that conservatives believe in limited government, not no government. Clearly, there are important functions of the federal government, starting with the national defense. But we have got to, stop the government from sticking its nose where it doesn't belong, and it's sticking its nose in a lot of places these days.
Turning to the subject of the U.S. House, Are you surprised that Nancy Pelosi was reelected Speaker of the House, and what does her leadership mean for the next 2 years?
I am surprised, and I am not surprised. On one hand, I cannot look back at her last tenure as Speaker of the House and say that she was particularly effective. On the other hand, I'm not surprised because the Democratic Party, for all the talk about the Republicans and Trump and the various issues they have, it's like herding cats right now, and it has been that way for a long time. They've got a huge problem on their hands, and the media doesn't want to talk about it or frame it as a problem, which is to say that in the Democratic Party, you have people like way on the far left setting the agenda, and the people who run things like congressional leadership have to do everything they can to sort of rein those people in, lest the rest of the Democratic Party look like a bunch of unelectable radicals. And certainly you're seeing that right now, where there's been a lot of stories recently where prominent voices in the Democratic Party who are even afraid to be quoted by name are basically making rumblings about, say, how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, this out and proud socialist freshman congressman from New York, needs to stop attacking Democratic leadership and pushing for all these radical ideas and saying all these outlandish and untrue things. And they're afraid to even criticize her by name, even though, a lot of things that Cortez has said are extremely dubious. Pelosi, it's not just a matter that Pelosi is one of the few people that can actually, being sort of in touch with the centrist Democrats, but also being a San Francisco liberal, can sort of bridge those divides. But also, she's, there aren't exactly people in the Democratic Party that are, lining up to do that job either, because it's a very thankless task to try and get Democrats all on the same page.
How do you explain Ocasio-Cortez's kind of disproportionate voice as a freshman representative there in the current Democratic caucus?
Well, that's a good question. Well, one is that she rather dramatically won her race as a complete unknown by defeating a member of a fairly high up member of the Democratic House leadership to win a race. The second is she's young, attractive, and checks a lot of sort of demographic boxes in terms of diversity and a lot of other hot issues in politics. Third, she just says a lot of like really dramatic and outlandish things that sort of cause people to pay attention. Whether she says things that are entirely untrue about the defense budget being $18 trillion or whatever it was she said it was. So it's kind of hard to ignore her in that context, but. And the other thing about it is she's got a populist sensibility, and in a weird way, she's kind of a sort of far left Trump. I mean, she does a lot of things that Trump does, and she's been scolding the media a lot lately. So she's got her sort of finger on the populist pulse. But at the same time, I am worried in the sense that I do think that there is definitely a move afoot both within the press and without it to sort of make her immune from reasonable criticism. And, two, people need to just realize that, while she is a rather interesting figure for all sorts of reasons, she's not exactly representative of the mainstream, and people should stop presenting her opinions as such.
The New York Times published a story on Friday. It reported that the FBI began an investigation of President Trump for alleged treason. What can you tell us about that late-breaking story?
Well, it's sort of an interesting story because, it was like a lot of these sort of quote-unquote bombshells that, newspapers keep dropping about, Trump's campaign and what was going on behind the scenes and Trump's relationship with Russia and all these other things. Except this one, more so than most, had a shelf life of about 15 seconds because the story reported that the FBI's, basic rationale for opening up this counterintelligence probe was, as the evidence for it was that Trump had fired Comey. And the only reason anyone would fire, FBI Director James Comey was if they were doing so at the behest of the Russians, which just makes absolutely no sense. And in fact, if anything, speaks to the fact that the FBI, was engaged in a pretty gross abuse of power, and they really do think of themselves as some sort of like, deep state avenging angels or something like that. I mean, whatever you want to say about Trump's firing of Comey, whether it was, the right thing to do politically or otherwise, it was completely completely within his constitutional authority to fire James Comey. And furthermore, who at this point in time can argue that James Comey wasn't anything other than a disaster as FBI director, considering the way that they handled the very terrible way they handled the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and the way that he went about doing all sorts of things, including constantly telling Trump privately that he wasn't under FBI investigation, and then leaking to the press all these public stories about that made it seem like the FBI was investigating Trump, even if they weren't officially doing it or whatever, or at least until Comey was fired. But I don't know. I mean, the story seems rather crazy. I mean, voters get the final say on what their foreign policy is. And if the FBI didn't like what Trump was doing to sort of smooth over tensions with Russia, that's not their job to rein that in. That's a matter of democratic accountability, and it's sort of frightening that our law enforcement agencies could ever be in a position where they think that they have that kind of authority.
We're getting a Washington update with Mark Hemingway, a Washington, D.C. journalist for 20 years. We'll talk about Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's investigation. Update on that right after this.